and preparing for this shiur, I realized that I have a few things that I have to overcome. There's a language barrier. We grew up in English, but not giving a shiur English. But giving a shiur about Yom Kippur, which is what I want to talk about, is much more a culture barrier than a language barrier. Because when I told them, and that's my wife, that I'm talking about Yom Kippur today, she said, but it's so far away. Like there's so much that's going to happen between today and Yom Kippur. And I told her, but all my American friends that are rabbis, they've been writing their drashot since Pesach. And it's really a different frame of mind that I think both have a lot to say for them. And Dafka, preparing for this shiur, I wanted to say something in the benefit of your way of looking at things and of preparing in advance. I love opening sentences of books. I studied literature, university, and the thing I love doing most is after I've read a book, looking at the opening paragraph, trying to see what's hidden in the open paragraph. If it's a good author, then she or he will be putting in something very meaningful in the beginning. It's nice to look at popular books that way. It's nice to look at the books of the Tanakh. It's nice to look at Jewish books. So the opening sentence of the Shulchan Aruch, the big Jewish code, don't know the name for Shulchan Aruch in English. I think it's just Shulchan Aruch. But the great Jewish code of law, written in the 16th century by Rabbi Yosef Karo and the Rima. So his opening sentence is, "Yitgaber ke'ari baboker le'avodat bo'o, sheyehe hu me'orer hashachar." I'll say it in Hebrew again, and I'll try and translate. He says, "Yitgaber ke'ari," you should wake up like a lion in the morning. "Yitgaber ke'ari baboker lakum le'avodat bo'o." It's like jump out of bed, as if you were a lion. I was once told that lions don't really jump out of bed. They actually take their time when they're waking up. But maybe Rabbi Yosef Karo didn't know that. He says, "Yitgaber ke'ari baboker le'avodat bo'o." And the next sentence is, "Sheyehe hu me'orer hashachar." You need to be the one waking the dawn. And he'll later on quote a Midrash about King David HaMelech, who says, "I'm not like all the other kings. All the other kings, the morning comes and the morning or the dawn awakens them. I awaken the dawn. I'm here before morning comes." And I thought a lot about why Rabbi Yosef Karo opens his monumental work of his life, not with a specific halacha, but just saying you should jump out of bed before sunrise. Doesn't even have to do shachrit. You can pray shachrit for many hours later. But he's saying, I want you to be prepared. When you're confronting life, don't let things happen. Try and be there 5 minutes earlier. Now, I was thinking of preparing for Chagim now, when they're almost 2 months away. And how nice the notion of, it's not just us, the whole idea of Elul, the month of Elul, taking a whole month and saying, we're going to prepare now for the high holidays. And when they come, we want to say to them like we were here first. Not in a I was here first way, but there's something that Rabbi Yosef Karo is trying to give to us, I think, in the way you lead life, of sheyehe hu me'orer hashachar. You need to awaken the dawn and not let the dawn awaken you. So we're still almost 2 months away, but I like the idea of approaching the Chagim. Since one of the tefillot I'm going to be talking about is Kol Nidre, you had me singing Kol Nidre for the past 2 or 3 days. And people thought it was very strange when I was walking down the street. But it's nice to be prepared. There's a Talmud passage in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, in Tractate Rosh Hashanah, on Daf Yud Aleph, page 11, in Rosh Hashanah, that says, it mentions different things that happened on Rosh Hashanah. One of them is that Sarah, Chana, and Rachel all gave birth. That the miraculous births of Sarah and of Rachel, our mothers, and also of Chana, Samuel's mother, it all happened on Rosh Hashanah. Another one of the miracles that the Talmud mentions is that Joseph was taken out of prison in Rosh Hashanah. And I thought to myself, that those are so different. They're both miracles, but they're so different in the way you're prepared for them. Because pregnancy takes 9 months, or at least it should take 9 months. And when the miracle of Isaac being born, or Joseph being born, to Sarah and to Rachel, it happened on Rosh Hashanah, there was 9 months of preparation. When Joseph was brought to the king of Egypt, I always imagine Joseph, he's sitting in the dungeon. He's been there for 2 years because nobody remembers who he is. And then King Pharaoh dreams a dream, and no one can solve the dream. So it says, the Hebrew is a Vairitzu minabor. They ran him out of the dungeon. Vaigalach, Vaichalef simlotav, Vayavo el Paro. They shaved him, they changed his clothes, and he was brought to Pharaoh. That happened on Rosh Hashanah. Now there was about, I think, 5 minutes between Yosef sitting in the dungeon and between Yosef facing Pharaoh. And what's so beautiful about that Talmudic passage is it's saying sometimes you'll approach the high holidays like Sarah or Chana. You'll have 9 months of thinking and preparation, and when Rosh Hashanah comes, you'll be prepared. Sometimes the Talmud says you'll be just like Joseph. He was pulled out of the dungeon and he was standing before the king or king of the universe within 5 minutes. His eyes were still getting used to the light. And I'm trying to think, what kind of Rosh Hashanah will we have this year? Because we're preparing and we're not preparing. Because at least here in Israel, and I think wherever you are, things are changing every day. And we don't know what kind of tefillot we're going to have. So we're preparing for many different scenarios. Are we going to stand there like Yosef, suddenly, which has its advantages, suddenly being put on stage and, okay, this is your Rosh Hashanah now? Or is it going to be more like Sarah and Hannah? So this is all our approach into the high holidays. And I'm going to be looking into 2 ideas of Yom Kippur. And I'm going to be trying to focus on those 2 ideas mainly through 2 different tefillot. I want to look at the communal part of this journey called Yamim Noraim, and at the personal one. I think both are very, very present. I perform lots of chupot for my students, something I enjoy doing very much. And I always tell them it's the most personal evening of your life, and you're going to have about 500 people there. And what's nice about a wedding is both those factors, or both those facts, play a very major factor in what a wedding is. It has to be very, very personal, and we have to have everybody there. And I think high holidays in general, and Yom Kippur maybe specifically, there's moments that will be very, very personal. That nobody knows what's going on in our heart or in our thoughts or in our prayers. I think at the point where we bow down, and in Yom Kippur you really bow down, and you're mamash on the floor, and your talis is covering you, and you're all there on your own. I know some people have a short snack, or when nobody else is singing, but you're mamash. There's these real personal moments, and there's very communal moments, and we really need the community. I'll be focusing more on community today, and in 2 days, in the second part, I'll try and focus on the more personal aspect. And I want to look at it through 2 tefillot, one which I think really harnesses the community and uses its power, which is Kol Nidre. And in 2 days, I want to look at Avodat HaKohen HaGadol, the high priest, which is most of what the Mishnah talks about in Yom Kippur. The Mishnah is sourced from the 2nd century. Most of what it has to say about Yom Kippur is what the high priest used to do in Yom Kippur. It's also, if you look at Yom Kippur in Torah, in the book of Leviticus, Yom Kippur is all about the high priest entering Kodesh HaKodashim. And he's very, very, very much alone. Nobody else can enter. The verse will say, "V'chol adam lo yeh b'oel moed, b'vo'o levaker b'kodesh ad tzeto." Nobody is going to be there from the second he steps in till the second he steps out. He's going to be there all by himself. And those two pivots hold two different very ideas, I think, of this Chag, and I want to look at both. So I'm going to try and run through some sources, and we're going to get to Kol Nidre and study a bit about Kol Nidre. I want to look at some biblical verses in the second part that I think have a lot to do with the origin of Kol Nidre. And I want to especially think of the role of community in Yom Kippur. I want to say something about community. I love seeing faces. I had to speak. I had the privilege of speaking last Wednesday at Hartman on a webinar in front of an empty room, an empty Beit Midrash, empty chairs and empty tables, mamash. And it's so different. This is a community, even though there's only faces. So I just want to call upon you to allow it to be a community. Anything that comes into mind, if you want to write up in the chat. Me and Jennifer were talking about this earlier, and if something comes up and I don't see it, so Jennifer will try and call my attention. I'll pause for questions, I think, also in the middle, for questions or remarks or thoughts. And then in the end, but please feel free to make this also communal learning. I'm going to see a bit less of your faces now because I'm going to share a screen. And from time to time, I'll allow myself the privilege to come back to this screen so we can all study together. So, okay, here we go. Okay, I hope you can all see. And I want to start with a short passage from Yamim Noraim, from Days of Awe. Yamim Noraim, or Days of Awe, is one of the books that Shai Agnon wrote. He actually didn't write it. It's the only book he didn't write. He wrote many other books. He won a Nobel Prize in 1966, I think, for all his writings, and he's a wonderful, wonderful writer. And in actually pretty late stage of his career, after he had put out 6 volumes of stories, he writes Yamim Noraim. Yamim Noraim is an anthology, and it's a collection of texts about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and all the days of Tishrei and the month of Elul. And after he won the Nobel Prize, he used to sign, one of his students said this, he would sign Shai Agnon, Mechaber Yamim Noraim V'Shar Sfarim. Shai Agnon, author of Yamim Noraim and other books, which is nice because this is the only book he really wasn't the author of. He puts into Yamim Noraim, into this anthology, a few things that he wrote on his own. He says they're from a book called Kol Dodi, a book he made up. He puts it in the bibliography in the end. It's a made-up book that nobody's ever heard of, but those are his personal thoughts that he alludes to a book called Kol Dodi. And he brings a short story that I just wanted to start with. It's about Reb Chaim Tzanz from the 19th century, the Tzanz Rebbe. Once our master, Rabbi Chaim of Tzanz, told a parable. A man had been wandering about in a forest for several days, not knowing which was the right way out. Suddenly he saw a man approaching him. His heart was filled with joy. Now I shall certainly find out which is the right way, he thought to himself. When they neared one another, he asked the man, "Brother, tell me which is the right way. I have been wandering about in this forest for several days." Said the other to him, "Brother, I do not know the way out either, for I too have been wandering about here for many, many days. But this I can tell you, do not take the way I have been taking, for that will lead you astray. And now, let us look for a new way out together." Our master added, "So it is with us. One thing I can tell you, the way we have been following this far, we ought follow no further, for that way leads one astray. But now, let us look for a new way." Now I was thinking that we're all searching. I feel many, many people are searching. I got an email about half an hour before the shiur from a bunch of rabbis with ideas for the high holidays. I didn't get the chance to read the email and share all the wonderful ideas with you, but I think we're all looking for some new way, and this new way is going to have a bit to do with what I want to talk about with Kol Nidre. Okay, so we're starting with Kol Nidre. As I was saying, I was singing the melodies because I think to many people you say Kol Nidre, those two words are enough. They're taken to their shul, and the chazan or the chazanit that they grew up with, and the melodies they're used to hearing from home. I was mentioning halacha before. Melodies are always something that anybody can choose. With Yom Kippur, there's mamash, it appears in halacha, in the Jewish code of law, that you can't change melodies on Yom Kippur. It's so interesting because the melody becomes, for people, part of, this is what we're used to. You can't take something that for the community, the melody is just like as meaningful as the words. And Kol Nidre, in the different edot, Ashkenaz, Farad, Teiman, we all have our melodies, but when we have our melodies, those are the melodies. And so Kol Nidre will take many people, mamash to the beginning, the first moments of Yom Kippur. And I want to look at this tefillah for a second. We'll say some things about it, and then we'll try and think of So I'm skipping the first verse with the agreement of God and community, and we'll get back to it soon. But I'm going to the words Kol Nidre, or in English, every vow and bind, oath, ban, restriction, penalty, and every term that sets things out of bounds. All that we vow or swear, ban or bar from ourselves. From this Yom Kippur until that which is to come, let it be for the good. Let it be for the good. Each one we regret. This, by the way, is one nusach. There's another one that says also from past Yom Kippur to this Yom Kippur, and from this Yom Kippur to the next Yom Kippur. We want to annul or dissolve any kind of bind, oath, ban, or restriction that we've taken. And this is how we open Yom Kippur. We say it 3 times. If I'm saying something that you do differently in the States, you're welcome to correct me. But at least in the shuls that I know, so you say this 3 times, and the chazan goes over, and they usually do it a bit louder, and sometimes they raise the tone, and they go up a note or up another note, and the whole congregation starts singing. And for all of us that have grown up on these melodies, we do like this great communal kind of a vidui. We're all saying something together, and we're all annulling our vows or dissolving all the vows, binds, bans, and restrictions that we've accepted upon ourselves. And this is the opening of Yom Kippur. And it's this long, Kol Nidre. It's 1 paragraph. But when people ask you where you're going to Kol Nidre. You're not going to Mariv. You're not going to the evening services. Like, the opening is Kol Nidre. And I don't know what it's like in the States, but in Israel, many shuls, you'll have 500 people for Kol Nidre and 75 for Mariv. Everybody comes to Kol Nidre just like everybody comes to Ne'ilah, to the end of the services, and then they'll walk out after this first 20 minutes and paragraph. So I want to look at what's so important about Kol Nidre. I want to look at a few of the problems that arose around Kol Nidre. And so just a bit of background. This prayer goes back about 1,000 years. It appears first in Sidurim of the Geonim, first appearing in the Sidur of Rav Amram Gaon in the 9th century, so it's a bit more than 1,000 years. The whole idea of dissolving our vows goes back to the Talmud, although there it's related to Rosh Hashanah. And when it's brought up in the Talmud, a lot of the Amoraim, a lot of the Talmudic scholars don't like the idea of annulling our vows. And even when the Geonim, 1,000 years ago, even if they put it in their Sidurim, each one of the Geonim, the period before the Rishonim that ends about 1,000 years ago, each one of them has something bad to say about this idea, even though they already put it in their Sidur, because it might have gained some power and people wanted to do it, but they speak out against it. They don't like the idea of annulling our vows. And if you do annul vows, and we'll get to it in a second, this is not the way to do it. And later on, many people came out against it. And a lot of the Rishonim in the 10th and the 11th century say that we shouldn't say it. And the Meiri in the 13th century says that we shouldn't say it. And slowly but surely, it makes its way into the Sidurim, and it becomes very present and very, very meaningful. And the dispute never really was totally solved. The Reform movement took this out of the Sidurim many years ago in the early 19th century. And it, from what I understood, made its way back only around 1980 into the official Sidur of the Reform movement. Over the years, it was also a cause for anti-Semitism, or for saying, here, you Jews don't stick to your word. And every time you want to do whatever you want, then you can swear and promise, but then you know you're going to get up in shul and say, all the promises that we made or that we're going to make don't really mean anything. So Kol Nidre, over the years, up to today, people don't really like the idea. And Jennifer, if I'm missing anything meaningful, or I don't know if it's questions or, well, I'll look at the chat soon, but if there's something that you feel that I missed or that I said not correctly.
There's just questions about where the melodies come from, if they're halacha, chazaka, or minhag, and where the expression Kol Nidre came from.
Kol Nidre, thank you, appears already in the Sidur of Rav Amram Gaon. I looked at the original. By the way, it's brought there in Hebrew and not in the Aramaic that we know. And the melody, I don't know. It's a very good question, and kind of embarrassed that I don't know. It's so basic. And I don't, like, everywhere I've gone, so there's a different variation on the melody. Jennifer, you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry. Mark corrected me. He wasn't asking where Kol Nidre, the phrase, comes from, but the phrase Bli Neder.
So I'll get to Bli Neder in a second. Okay? Bli Neder, I'll get to it in a second. So I want to give a bit more background about vows and dissolving vows, because the whole idea of dissolving vows, this happens to be this week's Parsha, or the Parsha that we read last Shabbat, Parashat Matot, and says that if somebody makes a vow, there it has a lot to do with gender. If a woman takes a vow, then her husband, when he hears her, can dissolve the vow or annul the vow, or if she's still living at home, her father can do it. But I'm putting the whole gender issue aside now. In Torah, the whole idea of dissolving a vow, there's like this few hour or 24-hour opening. If you said something and the person listening won't kind of accept your vow, then there's a chance. There's this window in which you can say, no, you don't really mean that, or you shouldn't do that. And then the vow doesn't really take place. But the idea of somebody really making a vow, and then the ability to say, no, we didn't really mean that, that's something that, according to the Mishnah, this is source number 3, if you've printed out your own pages. So according to the Mishnah, I'm here, the Mishnah in Masechet in Tractate Chagiga says the following. I'll read a line from the Hebrew. Heter nedarim porchim ba'avir ve'en lahem al ma she'yismochu. The laws concerning the dissolution of vows hover in the air and have nothing to rest on. This is a beautiful Mishnah, which basically it's very radical because it characterizes or tries to categorize different rules in Jewish halacha according to how much they can really base themselves on things that are written in the Torah. So it says, dissolving vows, basically we've totally made that up. They're hovering in the air and they have nothing to rest on. Then they'll say that like the laws of Shabbat, they're like are as mountains hanging by a hair. We have one verse in the Torah saying, Lo taseh kol melacha, don't do any melacha, any work on Shabbat. And on that, we've written volumes and volumes of laws. So it's like a mountain hanging on a hair. And then it says that there's different laws, civil cases, temple worship, purity and impurity. They have something to rest on, and they are the essentials of Torah. But it's interesting that the whole idea of dissolving vows, it's like the sages say, Chachamim say, we've made it up. It doesn't appear in the Torah. It's something that we've totally made up. And to go back to Kol Nidre, it's an interesting way to open up Yom Kippur. We're opening up with a prayer that is doing something which basically has no base in the Torah. We totally made it up. By the way, we're doing it not according to the way we made it up. Because if you do want to dissolve a vow, and I'll get to this in the end of the shiur, there's a special way to do it. And you're supposed to ask a certain question and find an opening, and it's not supposed to be communal, it's supposed to be very personal, and you need to say exactly what you did. So there's no base for standing up a whole community of people and just saying, we didn't mean anything we said last year, and we're not going to mean anything we're going to say in the following year, and then it's all. And even people who were in favor of saying this prayer, like the Rema, Rabbi Moshe Isserlich, who already puts it into the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century, he says, you can say the prayer, but don't count on it. If you really need to dissolve a vow, then say another prayer the way you should, personally, and say exactly what vow you want to dissolve. So nobody really trusts this. And it's an interesting, to walk into Yom Kippur by doing something that we really shouldn't be doing is a very interesting way of opening Yom Kippur. But with all the strange questions of doing something that we really shouldn't do in an improper way, on the wrong date because it should be on Rosh Hashanah, and with the wrong people, I still think there's something to say for Kol Nidre, and I want to look at it for a second. And here, this is where I want to look at community. I had the privilege of studying at yeshiva in Har Etzion. Jennifer and I were talking about this earlier. I missed her husband by a few years. But when I go back to my Yom Kippur, the most meaningful moments were 10 minutes before Kol Nidre, or actually 10 minutes after. They were very, they did Kol Nidre very early, because they were very strict on doing it before Shkia and the special time that you should do it. And then there was like 15 minutes before the next prayer started, before Mariv started. And after Kol Nidre, the shul was packed. There were like 1,000 people inside. And when Kol Nidre was finished, we had like 15 minutes to kill before Tfilat Arvit. And everybody, you started walking around very, very slowly because it was a big mass of people. You were like stuck in the middle and just meeting as many people as you could and saying Shana Tova and Ktiva V'Chatima Tova. And those 15 minutes are just being kind of squished between many other people are my strongest memory of Yom Kippur at Yeshiva. And I want to think of, I always felt something like safety in numbers. Like we're all here together. We're all squished here. Nothing can happen. The community is here to protect you. Somebody once asked me I would ever go on a roller coaster alone. No other people. Think of a roller coaster. When you get on a roller coaster and there's 100 people on the roller coaster with you, there's something that makes you feel, okay, there's a lot of other people here. Everything's going to be okay. And just being crammed in with everybody else and looking around and saying, okay, I'm safe. Everybody's here. And I want to think of that sense of community. Where do we use the fact that we're part of a community in order to allow ourselves to make major changes in our life? And like here, I feel going through Yom Kippur or going through all of Yomim Noraim or all of this period, you can do tshuva if everybody around you is doing tshuva. This is what we're doing now. And it's so much easier to do if this is something that we're all in this together. And I was thinking like in personal moments, when I invite, or when my parents invited all their friends to my bar mitzvah, or when you invite all your friends to your wedding, they're there to help you go through or move from one phase of your life to another, and to bear witness to the fact that you're changing. And I think they're really part of it. Mamash, it's if they weren't there, something really wouldn't change. Like the fact that everybody was there to see me have my bar mitzvah, if they weren't there, I would still be a little kid for them. In their eyes, I'd be stuck as an 11 or 12-year-old. But if they were there for me to read Torah with no mistakes except one, I still remember the mistake till today. I had a fever for the whole reading. What can you do? So they've helped you like cross the border. And I think the fact that we invite all the people that we love to our wedding, and also the ones that we don't love but we feel bad not inviting, but the fact that we've brought all those people there, it's really allows us to do something new, to become new people. If not, in their eyes, I'm stuck as somebody else. And if in their eyes I'm stuck as somebody else, in my eyes I'm also stuck. And this is what I want to say for a second. I want to look at vows. Look at this little prayer is from a prayer called Hatarat Nedarim. The many Jews will say before Rosh Hashanah, even though they're going to say Kol Nidre. And this is like a dissolving of vows that you say the way you should. And you say exactly what you've done, or you say at least you're a bit more specific. And you don't do it with the whole community together. You say it in front of 3 people. And it says the following. Shimuna Rabotayim in source number 4. דיינים מומחים, כל נדר או שבועה וכל שום קבלה, אפילו של מצווה, and then I'm going to the bold that says, איזה דבר טוב שנהגתי 3 פעמים, ולא התניתי שיהיה בלי נדר. This is the term בלי נדר. Any action, I'm in the bold in English, I performed 3 times without explicitly saying that I was not vowing to perform it. What's a neder according to this prayer? A neder is not somebody getting up and saying, okay, this is a vow I want to take. A neder, there's many nedarim in our life. Anything that we've done and that we're used to doing, those become the vows of our life. So if you eat cornflakes every day, or Cheerios, I forgot I'm speaking to an American crowd, then, and you've done it again, over again and again, those are like your vows. And what are our vows? Our vows that are very difficult for us to break and change, are just what we've become used to doing. Now I want to look at community and our ability to change, because the change as an individual, I think, is hard enough. When I was learning to be a teacher, a teacher's course, we had a course of Psychologia shel hayeled, psychology of children. I don't remember much from the course. I remember Piaget, and I remember Piaget's theory of how children learn. And I remember the teacher talking about how we put things into boxes. and you grow up and there's two people in your life, and a child growing up with a Abba and an Ima, for example. Um, so then he'll know that there's these two people who feed him and who smile at him, and they sometimes throw him in the air, and they sometimes give him food, and they're always at him, and they're saying, say Abba, say Ima. And at some point when they're very nice to him and they give him very good food, he'll look up and say, okay, I've decided to be a good boy today. And he'll look at the mother, for example, and say Ima, and she'll be so excited and her face will light up and she'll call everybody, and he'll realize that he did something good. And then when the other person walks into the room, he says to himself, okay, I'll be nice to this guy too. And he looks at him and he says Ima, and nobody smiles and nothing really happens. And then they say, no, Abba. So now he has two categories in his mind, Ima and Abba. And I remember him explaining how with each category, then the little child will make like more megirot, more drawers. And then they'll have uncle and Ima and Abba and friend and brother and sister. And when he needs to, or when this little child needs to, they'll open another drawer. And I remember the teacher explaining that the funny thing to see with children is they don't like making new drawers. And if they can do with the drawers they have, then they'll make do with what they have. Like children in Hebrew, I don't know funny mistakes that children make in English, but like they call an Eliyahu Navi, Eliyahu Navim. You ever heard of Eliyahu Navim? Instead of Elijah the prophet, it'll be Elijah the grape. Or instead of Eliyahu HaTishbi, it'll be Eliyahu Al Tishvi. Eliyahu, don't sit down. Those of you who aren't following the Hebrew, I'm sorry, but there's the funny things that kids will say, because they don't have a term for Hanavi, they only know Anavim. So they're not going to open a new drawer. They're not going to change something. They'll try and squish things into what they already know. It's funny with children, it's more upsetting with adults, because we also have categories. And instead of opening a new drawer for somebody who's a bit different than what we know, we'll try and squish them into the categories. It's difficult for us to change. It's difficult for us to move into a new category. The interesting thing is if we can already change, then sometimes the people around us will be putting us back into the same spot where we were trying to move from. And these vows that we accept upon ourselves, the things we do again and again, it's hard enough for us to change them. But even if we have, then people around us will be pushing us back exactly into the place where we know. I was a mechanech, I think you call it homeroom teacher, in 11th grade in a school called Himmelfeld. One of the students that I loved was not a great student, and he also didn't behave too nicely. And he was about to be kicked out of school. And we were very, very close. And I remember the day that I said to him, listen, you have to come with the books and with a notebook. You have to listen. You have to be quiet during class. And if not, you're just not going to be here. And he promised me, he said, I promise you, I'm going to try. And I remember his first class, he came with a book. And he took out a notebook and a pen. I didn't believe he had those things. And 5 minutes passed and I'm looking at him and he's there and he's listening and he's writing. And 10 minutes into the class, he was still hanging on. The sad thing was, I started to hear the remarks from the side. People were saying to him, hey, Yair, what happened? You suddenly became a new student? Well, you have nothing to say? And he had already made the change, but everybody was pushing him back to the place where he was trying to move from. What's so meaningful, I think, about Kol Nidre? Community can do one of two things. One, it allows us to change if it's willing to see that we've changed. If we brought all our friends to our wedding and they see us standing under the chuppah, they've realized we've grown up and it's not our bar mitzvah and we've gone through something. If not, we might be stuck where we were before. What are we saying at Kol Nidre? At Kol Nidre, we're saying, listen, we want to be a community but we've all come together in a different way than what we all come together throughout the year. Throughout the year, we're helping you just be the same person. And if you're not up to your regular self, we'll try and lift you up because we know who you are. And we'll accept even difficult behavior because we know you're the good person. We'll always be pushing you back to where you are, and that's a wonderful thing as a community. Kol Nidre is saying the opposite. It's saying we've all come here today, but we're saying Kol Nidre because we want to be the kind of community, not that puts you back into the square A, but we want to be the kind of friends and community around you that are saying, we believe you can be different than what you've been before. And we're all going to stand here, not to really annul our vows, and not to do it in a way that it's something we made up and doesn't really work in halacha. Just to say, we've come together as different people, or in a different way that we always come together. And there's something beautiful of all being in the room with people who have known you for 50 years, but the only thing that they're saying is, I've known you for 50 years, but today and now, I'm willing to let all of that go. And to see a new person that I've never seen before. You need a lot of koach, a lot of power to do that. And in that sense, I think Kol Nidre is a very, very special moment in thinking about what Yom Kippur is. Not only personally, but what kind of community can we be? Can we set aside what we've always thought about people, about each other, about our rabbi, about our shul, about what can be? Can we, for one day, be a different kind of community? And what we are all year is good. It helps us keep in place. But for one day, can we be, for a second, something else? I want to stop for a second. Look at the chat, or if people have something they want to remark, I'm going to see your faces for a second before I get to Moshe and to some of the origins of Kol Nidre. And I'll also open the chat here on the side. But if somebody wants to say something. Okay.
We have someone who raised their hand. I believe it's...
Yeah, I'm just, I'll get to the hand in 1 second. I'm relating some of the things we've related to. And Rabbi Katz asked here about what is the action called Eze Davar Tov. The word Tov, I think, is a good thing. And Nedarim and vows that we want to annul can also be good things. I remember, by the way, not wanting to do good things because I was afraid that would obligate me for the future. I never davened 3 times a day before I went to yeshiva. It wasn't something I was used to. And I remember when I got to yeshiva, everybody was davening 3 times a day. And the first time I said, okay, I'll do Mariv. Everybody's doing Mariv. But I said, hey, if I do Mariv, does this mean I have to do it tomorrow or the next day? It doesn't have to be bad things. The things that we get used to doing are in Siddur. And okay, we'll get into the text in a second. How do you respond in these days of being community at a distance? I'm going to get to the distance in a second. Okay? I think, by the way, in the way of what I was speaking now, the distance has a bit of an advantage. We're not only saying to each other, things can be different. This year, we're forced to be different. And we're forced to be a different kind of Yom Kippur. And we're not only saying Yom Kippur can look differently and we can daven differently, we're much experiencing it. In that sense, the distance can come to our aid and not be against us. Somebody was raising their hand before I go back to the chat. So who was it?
Yeah, I just have a question.
Yeah.
Did different communities adopt Kol Nidre at the same time? Like, did Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Mizrahim adopt Kol Nidre at the same time, or it was like close to each other? Yeah, that was my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Saina, I hope I pronounced that right.
Yeah, my Hebrew name is Mordechai ben Moshe, so whichever is easier.
Okay. Ashkenaz was the first. Different figures like the Maharami Rothenberg, which is already 13th century, much embedded it into the tefillah, because they had a lot of the Rosh Rabbeinu Asher, who's a bit of Ashkenaz and a bit of Sfarad, he said good things about the tefillah, and he was a very prominent figure for both communities. So it started in Ashkenaz, and people like the Rosh and others brought it also into Sfarad. I'm not familiar with like if it's also said in Minhag Teiman, but Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, it's totally widespread. Okay. Just look for 1 second. Okay, there's a question from Ellen about the tension, about changing and keeping loyalty. And that's what I want to look at now. And because it's already 10 to 10, I'm going to run into the other sources for a second and try to make the whole point and then open up for more questions. So I'm going to go back to text for a second. And I want to look at the first vow ever annulled. So this is about Kol Nidre. And I'm going to run through this. So we really have the chance to go through this. The verses I want to look at, or I'm going to describe, and I won't be reading mamash inside so that we really have a chance to do them, are the verses in Exodus 32, 33, and 34, known as Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf, starting with the sin itself, but then going on into all the prayers of Moshe, and until the final forgiving of God in chapter 34, when he also reveals himself to Moshe, and he also says the words that we use again and again on Yom Kippur, the 13 attributes, Hashem, Hashem, El Rachum V'Chanun. Also, you might be more familiar with the melody, maybe. Hashem, Hashem, El Rachum V'Chanun, Nerech Apayim V'Rav Chesed V'Emet. Those 13 midot, which basically make up a lot of the tefillot in Yom Kippur, and a lot of the tefillot leading up to Yom Kippur. And this all goes back. According to tradition, this happened on Yom Kippur. And the Talmud will say this is the first dissolving of a vow. And I just want to look at the Hebrew for a second. I'll go back to the English. But in chapter 32, after verses 7, 8, and 9, or 7, 8, 9, and 10, the sin. So God speaks to Moshe. I'll read maybe a bit in the English. I'll go up to the English. I apologize. So in verse 7, the Lord spoke to Moses, hurry down for your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt. He's blaming Moshe. Your people, you brought them out of Egypt. They've acted basely. They've been quick to turn aside from the way that I enjoined them. They made themselves a molten calf and bowed low to it and sacrificed to it, saying, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And then in verse 9, the Lord further said to Moshe, I see that this is a stiff-necked people. Now let me be. My anger may blaze forth again against them, and that I may destroy them and make of you a great nation. So, let go of me. Let me get rid of them. We'll have a new nation out of you. After these verses, Moshe says the following, and this I'll start reading in Hebrew. Verse 11 says the following, Vayechal Moshe et pnei Adonai Elohav. ויאמר למה אדוני יחרה אפך בעמך שהוצאת מארץ מצרים בכוח גדול וביד חזקה. I'm reading the Hebrew because the word Vayechal appears nowhere else in the Torah. It's what we call a milah yechidait, a single word that appears nowhere else. There's a word lo yachel devaro, yud, chet, and lamed are used otherwise, and we'll get to that in a second, but the term, the phrase Vayechal appears nowhere else. The translation will say in verse 11 here, but Moses implored the Lord his God, saying, let not your anger, O Lord, blaze forth against your people. But the translation misses, it's not their fault because they don't know how to there's no way to really translate, but vayichal, and it's pnei, it's like he's looking for his face. It's like when somebody's very angry and you're saying, here, wait, look at me. You want to catch their eyes or their gaze for a second. Moshe is saying, so the Talmud in Tractate Brachot, in page 32, it's source number, source number 7, goes into the word vayichal. Reading at the bottom of page 5. The Torah continues. Here they translate beseeched. And Moses beseeched before the Lord. What does vayichal mean? Many interpretations were given for this uncommon term vayichal. None of the sages know what vayichal is. So Rabbi Elazar says, it teaches that Moses stood in prayer before the Holy One, blessed be He, until it made him ill. Because the word vayichal sounds in Hebrew a bit like machala, like being sick. And others will use the word in Hebrew chalchala. It made him like all shaky. And there will be very many interpretations in the Talmud. One of them, at the bottom of page 5, says, Rava said, until he nullified his vow. What did Moshe do to the Kadosh Baruch Hu? He dissolved his vow. Vayichal appears one more time in Torah, in the chapter that we read this week. If somebody makes a vow, it says, Lo yachel devaro. Lo yachel devaro is, don't make it chol, don't make it chulin, don't make it simple. Allow your words to be holy. Don't make them ordinary. So what did Moshe do to God? On Yom Kippur was the first dissolving of vows. God said he's going to destroy the people of Israel. And Moshe said, I'm dissolving your vow. And the vow, Be'emet, is dissolved. And in the end of chapter 34 will be the Hitgalut. God will reveal himself to Moshe, and then we'll have Hashem El Rachum V'Chanun. The idea of God resolving his vows goes back to the tension that somebody was asking about earlier. And maybe I'll say this without looking into the text. I'm just saying which text I'm going to talk about. In the book of Samuel, there's a big question. There's a true question about dissolving vows. And the whole idea that I was trying to share about saying to people, you can change, you can be different, you don't have to live up to your word, is not always an easy idea. Because we promised. Like when I grew up, my parents said, you should say the truth. And especially if you promised something. And especially if you took a vow. And the passage in the book of Samuel, there's a whole story, many of you might remember it, the King Saul sins, and Samuel says to him, Samuel the prophet says, okay, God has decided you're not going to be king anymore. And then King Saul realizes he did something wrong and says, maybe you can plead with God and he'll forgive me. And Samuel looks at him and says, what do you think God is? And uses the term, Netzach Yisrael lo yeshaker v'lo yinachem. God doesn't lie, and he doesn't go back on his word. If he said something, he's going to do it. And if he said you're not going to be king, then you're not going to be king. Netzach Yisrael lo yeshaker v'lo yinachem. That God doesn't regret, because regretting or going back on our word is like making a lie. The beautiful thing is a few verses later, God will turn to Samuel the prophet and say, listen, I regret that I did the following. Like God is saying to Samuel, you're not going to decide if I can regret things or not regret things. And looking at something differently or reevaluating something is not making a lie. It's looking at things differently. And the tension between keeping our word and our ability to go back is a very interesting tension. And it's nice to see how Chachamim looked at how we annul our vows. So I'll just read this last source and then I'll open up again. So I'm going back to the sources. In the last source, again in the Mishnah, in Nedarim, it says, how do you annul vows? If somebody made a vow and you want to dissolve it, you ask them many questions, basically trying to see if they took everything into account, if they knew what exactly they were doing, or if they would realize what implications it would have, would they still take the vow? Okay? If you took a vow to be a vegetarian, and then you came to your Ima for Shabbat, and she made roast beef, and there's nothing like her roast beef, and you want to dissolve the vow, so you go to shul and you get 3 people together and you say, okay, I want to dissolve the vow. So they're supposed to ask you, if you knew your mother would make roast beef and invite you for Shabbat, especially with the special gravy that she has, would you still take the vow? And if you say, no, if I had thought of the fact that I wouldn't have taken the vow, that's what you call a petach, an opening. So basically they're saying to us, if you knew what would come, or if you knew the implications, or what it would do to people, the vow you took, would you go back on your word? And basically he's saying you're not going back on your word. We're just trying to see not what you said, but what you really, really said, or not what you meant. But if we went down deep inside, is this what you really, really meant? If God promised to destroy the people of Israel, and Moshe dissolves his vow, he's not saying, I want you to regret what you said. He's saying, listen, I want to allow you to see the people of Israel in a way that you haven't seen them before. And if you can recognize all these good things about them, would you have still said what you said? And annulling vows, I wanted to say as a community, is also being a community that's willing to free people of who they were. But it's also a community saying, we're willing to accept upon ourselves a new way of looking at people, or a new way of looking at reality, and to see things in others, not just the way they are, but the way they can be, or to look for the good in them that we didn't see. So basically, when we're standing up as a community in Kol Nidre, I think there's so much power within the community. And I think it really is there to allow us to change. And there's so many things that we can't do alone. The bad side of community can be that it'll keep us frozen in the place where we always were. So getting together for Kol Nidre is saying 2 things. It's saying we're here not to allow you to be the Dani you've always been, but to recognize you can be somewhere else, somebody else. And not to look at you the way we've always looked at you, but to say we're willing to see something in you that we never saw before. And I think entering Kol Nidre, or entering Yom Kippur, with our thoughts of trying to start something new, with all these ideas of what it means to take a vow, or to change or not to change, it's time for me is it's not just to find myself crowded amongst the people, it's to find myself crowded amongst all these people in a very special moment of who they want to be and how they want to look at others at this moment. So I'm going to go back to faces for a second and take some questions, and then maybe try and tie things together and sum up. So Besimcha, anybody who wants to share or to ask or... So I want to thank Eva. The word nichamti does appear before the flood. It's the first time the Kadosh Baruch Hu regrets. He says he regretted making humans. So thank you. It's very interesting that the term Lehinachem appears with God, and really, and nowhere in the Tanakh he says that he doesn't regret things. King Samuel the prophet will say it in his name. And I want to agree with Sarah that seeing people that we've written off in a new light is very, very difficult. Mamash. And Rabbi Katz is writing about how God can regret or change God's vow. Can you repeat it? I'll maybe repeat it, and I just want to add another word. You're not allowed to lie, and in many ways, what Samuel is saying, he has a strong case that going back on our word is really not telling the truth. So I want to bring an example, maybe from somewhere else. There's when I was studying to be a Rav in Israel, you learn a lot of halakha. I was learning the halachot of grieving and of deceased, and there's a whole chapter about giving a hesped. And in the Shulchan Aruch, there's a following paragraph which I always found very interesting. It says, when you're giving a hesped, this is what the Shulchan Aruch says. You should say all the good things about the deceased person, and then add a bit, which I always found very interesting, because it's not saying the truth. And the Taz, the Turei Zahav, a 17th century commentator, Rabbi Dani Segal. I always like to think maybe we were related. But he asks a question that was in my mind also. He says the following, I'll say it in Hebrew first, Mali sheker mu'at, mali sheker merubeh. If you're lying, it doesn't matter if you're lying a bit, if you're lying a lot, you're still lying. And he asks, how can the Shulchan Aruch write that you're supposed to say everything and then just add a bit? Mali sheker mu'at, mali sheker merubeh. A lie is a lie. And then he gives two answers, and I want to use them to explain how you can go back on your word. One, he says that we don't see people for who they really are usually in life, because we're always a bit jealous, and we always want to see ourselves in a better manner. So when we speak about them when they're alive, we'll always put them down a bit. When they're dead, we should say a bit more than what we've always said, because that's who they really are, which is a nice way to get around it. I'll say the second thing he says, because that gets also to Rabbi Katz's question. The second thing he says is, we're all a bit better than not only the deceased, we're all a bit better than who we think we are. If you give $100 to tzedakah, if you were pushed a bit more, you would actually give 120. And if you did this good deed, if somebody would say, can you just do a bit more, you would. We're just lazy sometimes, we're all sorts of things. But he's saying our true selves, who we really are, is just a bit more than what we usually are. And when you're giving a hesped, and you're saying who the person was, the eulogy, sorry for using the Hebrew word. When you're giving a eulogy and you're saying a bit more about the person, the Taz says you're actually telling the truth. Not the truth that we're used to saying, the real truth. Annulling vows or dissolving vows, especially the way the Talmud puts it in Moses' mouth when he's speaking to God, it's not saying go back on your word. It's saying I want to show you that the true people of Israel are a bit different than what you've always thought. Going back on a personal vow is not saying, oh, forget what you said. It's saying you didn't take everything into consideration. And if you're willing to go and look at things again, so the new view will come there, and that will be the real truth. It won't be a lie. And Kol Nidre is an obligation, a personal, communal obligation to try and see ourselves and others, not how we are, but how we really, really are. And I think it's a very uplifting moment to start Yom Kippur with. And I'm just thinking, I keep thinking that everything will look so different this year. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And I think I wanted to look at the different way of things being different as something that can even give us some koach or can uplift us. And say, we're always asking ourselves, can we really be different? Can we make changes? Can we be a different person? Can we be a different community? And I think we're learning that we can in many ways, that we can still reach out to people if they're not next to us. We can still care about them, and we can do services in a different way. And we can keep our communities going even though we're challenged in so many ways. And if we've done so many things differently, and we can still keep doing them, there's something I think very comforting. And I think with a lot of belief in who we are as personal people, as communities, that change is possible. And we've said it every year. I think this year we're experiencing it. And I hope we can use it to uplift us, to give us koach. And that's the part of community that I really wanted to talk about. And where we are in this as individuals is something that I want to raise, Bezrat Hashem, God willing, on a Wednesday.